And I've just given you 3 little prompts there. Ongoing call to embrace stewardship, time, talent, and treasure, the impact on the giver and the receiver. And let's just stay with those 2, okay? What's already happening? My guess is you've already surfaced some of those in your phone call, listen to me, in your conversations. And then the next step is to dream. What would this look like in the ideal? What do we really want it to be? So now we have, here's where we are, here's where we want to be. How are we going to take the next steps? And so the third step, which we will not get to today, because you need to go back and talk with others in your parish about this, is, okay, so what would the next steps be? How do we discern? What might this look like for the next year or the next 6 months? And then eventually you start building a plan. Who's going to do what, when, how, etc. So for right now, just for the next 10 minutes, why don't you just try scribbling some things on your own? And then when we come back from lunch, this is where we'll start. We'll start with just a brief little moment of sharing. Just think about that. How do you call people to live as good stewards now? What might that look like in the future? How do you invite people to make that commitment to giving of their time and their talent and so on? What might that look like in the future? And then when we come back, we'll take a little bit of time as we reconvene to think about that in our groups. So we're going to take about 10 minutes for that, and then we're going to break for lunch. So I don't know if any of you have been introduced to the music of Jesse Manabusen. Jesse's a friend of mine. Wonderful pastoral musician. Does a lot with teens. And I had the blessing, Jesse and I for years had said, we really need to work together. We're always at conferences and we kind of wave to each other in the hallway. And so lo and behold, out of the grace of God, I got to do a parish leadership retreat with him one time. And so as we were doing our final little moments of prep, he said, I have a couple of teeny tiny little videos that I think we need to include in the day. And so I want to share these with you. They require no sound. I'll turn the sound on, but you don't really need it. But I think that they kind of speak to where we're going in the course of this afternoon. So here we go. It's smarter to travel in groups. One more. Is that you? Best way to start after lunch. It's smarter to travel in groups. So, we spent a lot of time and attention and thought this morning about that vision of the community of disciples and stewards. And we thought about some very particular ways of sort of crafting stewardship in the parish. Now we're going to make a slight shift. And we're going to broaden our thought a little bit and really focus on community. Focus on the parish community. And some very particular ways in which we can help to foster community in order for people to really be open to the message of Jesus Christ and to the call to live as good stewards. So that's where we're going for this afternoon. And so our real kind of shared desire is to help people, each other and those in our parishes, to live their lives as disciples and to grow as good stewards. That's the kind of the big picture. So we keep that big picture in our minds and in our hearts, and then we begin to think about, so what does that look like? I have to tell you, when I first read Pope Francis's letter on the joy of the gospel, it just made my heart happy. because he speaks about the role of the parish community in such a loving way. And he actually talks about how, this is going to take some work. It's going to take some planning. It's going to take some thinking about what we're going to do. And we can't just keep on going idly around in the ways that maybe we have in the past, because the world has changed. And our parish life has to be responsive to people in our time. And so he talks about the evangelizing community. He talks about the parish as the evangelizing community. And in the joy of the gospel, he says, the first step of this is we need, each of us, to be open to an encounter or to a renewed encounter with God's love daily. This is an ongoing relationship. And that out of that encounter with God's love, we will be sent forth as missionary disciples. And the place in which that most readily happens is in the parish, in the evangelizing community. And he says the evangelizing community recognizes that the Lord has taken the initiative. I love that. Because we spend days like this and we all of a sudden we start thinking, oh my gosh, it's all up to us. Did you notice, by the way, that in the midst of that graphic with the steps, the Holy Spirit was in the middle? There was a reason for that. Because as disciples and stewards, we're going to be people of prayer. We're going to rely on the Holy Spirit to guide us, to strengthen us, to inspire us. And we're going to remember that the Lord takes the initiative. It's our job to be responsive, to be open, and to allow God to work through us. He goes on to say that such a community has an endless desire to show mercy. As Pope Francis has talked about this extraordinary Jubilee year of mercy, he uses a word that doesn't exactly have an English translation because it's a verb. We need to be mercying. That's big. How are we mercying? And so the community has this endless desire to show mercy because great mercy has been shown to us. He says, let's try a little harder to take the first step, to become involved in people's lives by word and by deed. And he actually kind of says, but not in an intrusive sort of way, just in a way that's going to help people when they're ready, when the time comes, to be responsive to the love of God in their lives. He says the evangelizing community bridges distances. We're going to think about that in a little while. What does that look like? And then he goes on to say that the evangelizing community is going to be supportive every step of the way. And we're going to bear great fruit. We're going to bear great fruit. And we're going to do this with a life of joy. Now, Father Michael Himes, who I mentioned earlier, talks about joy. And he says, joy is not the same thing as happiness. Happiness is dependent upon 1,000 external factors, whereas joy is something deep. And joy can sit alongside disappointment and grief and hurt and fear. But joy is that sense that God is with us in the midst of all of that. And that's the kind of community that we're fostering as we lead people to live their lives as good stewards. So what does that look like? What happens? What happens in people's lives if that's the kind of parish community that they live and grow in? Well, here's where I want to share about that Gallup research on engagement. The Gallup research on engagement actually began when some senior executives at the Gallup organization went to their Methodist pastor and said, we've been working a lot with organizations of all different kinds, hospitals and schools and nonprofits and businesses. And what we found is in every case, in every kind of organization, when people feel like they belong to whatever that organization is, they're more likely to live out the outcomes that the organization's trying to foster. And we've become convinced that maybe there's something about this in relationship to being church. So would you be willing to come help us think about that? And so they took their research on engagement and they applied it to church life. And they were stunned by what they found, because what they found is that the correlations are higher in faith than in any other aspect of people's lives. Well, that doesn't surprise us, does it? No, because we know what happens when somebody really is deeply rooted in the parish community. Here's what the research shows. Those who are engaged, those who have that deep sense of belonging, are much more likely to say that they pray every day, that they forgive others when they've been hurt, that their faith gives them a different kind of meaning in their lives. Those who are rooted in their faith communities are willing to take a stand on account of their faith even when it's unpopular to do so. They're willing to speak words of kindness when encouragement is needed. I always get to that part and I go, oh my gosh, we need so many more of these people in the world. Those people who are engaged in their faith communities are much more likely to invite. They're much more likely to say, why don't you come with me to Mass, to a social, to whatever it is. They're more thankful people. In the words of the research, they're satisfied with the circumstances of their lives, no matter what those circumstances are. And actually, the more likely to be engaged are less affluent. Because, we can get all caught up in the trappings of what we have, what we own, and we lose sight of what's really important sometimes in life. They're more likely to serve in their parishes and in the wider community, and they're more likely to give of their financial resources. They give on average about 2.5 hours a week in service, and they give about 5% of their income annually. Belonging makes a difference. And as you probably saw, this is in relationship to children in schools and in our religious ed programs. They're more likely to achieve. They're more likely to stay. They're less likely to be absent. Catechists are more likely to sign on for another year. And they're more likely to stay safe. They have fewer safety incidences in schools and programs where the students and the faculty have that deep rootedness together. And then the biggie. In most cases, believing doesn't lead to belonging, but rather belonging leads to believing. So the faith community has a huge role to play in people's lives. And like I said, I know that we know this in our hearts, but I know that sometimes we forget it or we lose sight of it. The research actually describes 3 groups of people that every parish has to one degree or another. Some are engaged. They're the ones we've already been describing. They're more likely to be spiritually committed. They're more likely to invite. They're more likely to give. They're a small group. We'll look at that in a moment. The larger group are the ones that are not engaged. The thing to know about the not engaged is that they're not negative. They really are waiting, mostly unconsciously, sometimes consciously, for somebody to draw them in. But it's not as likely to happen just by way of like an announcement at Mass. It's going to be personal invite. It's going to be that, why don't you come with me? So we rely on those like yourselves who are engaged to be the ones that are drawing others in. The not engaged are less likely to invite, and they're more likely to leave. Sometimes they leave for a reason. And that varies. That's a very generational thing as well as just a very personal thing. Sometimes, somebody makes them angry, especially among our younger adults. Our younger adults are really struggling with just the whole idea of faith. They look at faith as being opposed to science. They don't understand that the two can coincide together. And that's a real issue for many of our young people. Many people struggle with what they see as the hypocrisy of believers that, we go to church, but then we keep sinning. And so they struggle with that. But more likely, they just stop coming. I often say, I think building engagement is like building Velcro. We want to get people stuck and we want to keep them stuck. Because if they're stuck with us, they're less likely to get out of the habit of coming. Somebody's going to notice if they're gone. We had a gentleman at our parish. We lived on our church was on this very busy street, but there was a little neighborhood just to the side of us, and there was one older fellow who walked to daily mass, and he reminded me of Tim Conway, doing the old man. He kind of shuffled down the street. Well, we reached a point where all of a sudden we went for like 3 days and we hadn't seen him. Many of us didn't even know his name, but somebody finally went down and knocked on his door and just said, "We're just worried about you. Are you okay?" Actually, I had the flu, and so I haven't been able to get out. Well, do you need anything? And he looked at whoever this was, they told us later, and said, "My gosh, you care." Well, yes, we care. So, but that there's a stuckness there that happens. They're also less likely to give. They're less likely to volunteer. They're less likely to give of their financial resources. They're less likely to live as good stewards. Now, there's also a third group, and the third group are actually combined. They're two groups. They're called the actively disengaged. And the actively disengaged, some of them are the ones that maybe come to mind if we would hear that phrase. They're the ones that only come every now and again. A friend of mine calls them the flower people because they only come to church when there are flowers. Easter, Christmas, baptisms, weddings, funerals, first communions. That kind of covers it, right? And we spend a lot of time trying to figure out what to do about those people, don't we? We spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to get the ones who have left back. And then there's a second group of actively disengaged, and every parish has a few of them. They're the ones that are always complaining. They're the cave dwellers. They're consistently against virtually everything. And I wish I had coined that term, but I didn't. The guy that did the research is the one that coined that term. And we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what to do about them too. Yeah. Especially if we happen to have one of them in one of our groups. Because we know that as soon as we cover whatever fuss that was, they're going to have another fuss. And it's just going to be this constant thing. Here's what the research says. Among Catholics, about 16% nationally are engaged. 16. 1-6. So those of us who over the years have said, in our parish the 20-80 rule exists, 20% of the people do everything and the other 80% just kind of like come along, that's actually pretty accurate. The feeling is pretty much there. 49% are the not engaged. They're the great opportunity. They're with us almost every week. But they come and then they leave, and they come and they leave. They've not made that connection. And because they haven't made that connection, they're not living their faith in the same kind of way. A friend of mine is a pastor on Long Island, and actually his previous parish was the case study for all of this research when it was reported. And they were in a situation where they were in a building that they didn't have a church building. They had an all-purpose room that got set and reset and set and reset. And because of that, they had this like vestibule area that served as everything for the parish. And so Father Bill, being the kind of wry New Yorker that he is, had a banner made that went on the back wall of that vestibule area. It said, "Really engaged parishioners stay for the final blessing." Because that's the picture. Those non-engaged people, they're the ones that leave as soon as communion's over because they want to get out of the parking lot, Now, I have to tell you my own personal experience, and this fascinated me. I told you the story of how Steve and I took that transfer and we were gone for 4 years, and in that moment, I began to travel. So this was not about the parish. This was simply about me, but nonetheless, Steve had gotten super involved. I'm traveling. This time of year, I will not be at my home parish again for Mass until October 15th. So, I'm gone 6-7 weekends in a row. I come back. Steve's become acquainted, right? So he's, after Mass, he's visiting. He's talking with this group. He's got his little notepad, making notes, you know. I am not, he's an engineer. I am not making this up. I found myself one weekend backed against the wall, arms folded, foot tapping, thinking to myself, could we please just go home? I had become not engaged. It happened so easily. It was just so easy. And that's what happens with most of our people. The engagement research, anecdotally, they don't have any proof of this yet, but they believe it takes about 6 weeks. We have about 6 weeks to catch people and start connecting them before they start slipping into the not engaged. We can engage them, but it takes a little bit more to engage folks after they've become not engaged than it does just to get them from the get-go. I'm working with parishes throughout the United States, all different sizes and shapes and configurations, that are intentionally building engagement. And they begin to see life shift. They begin to see people. And I've become convinced that part of what happens here is, if we're calling people to discipleship and if we're asking them to live as good stewards, it is a life of ongoing conversion. I think engagement, I think helping people to have that sense of belonging opens people's minds and hearts in a different sort of way. I think of it as the liturgical documents talk about how in order to really experience the fullness of the mystery that is present in the Mass, we have to have a certain predisposition. I think that sense of belonging is part of that. That when we're swimming in the water, so to speak, we're breathing the air of a faith community that's living this, then this becomes the norm. Then this is what we do here. And it's different. We hear the readings differently. We hear the homily differently. We're praying the Eucharistic prayer with our hearts and our minds because we're surrounded by other people who are doing the same. And that makes a big difference. So what I love about this research is it doesn't only describe the importance of belonging. It doesn't only describe those 3 groups of people. It actually helps us to understand what happens. What does it take to build this kind of engagement? And the research actually says there are 4 questions that people are asking, all of us. Think about this in the lens of your own experience. As people are coming into a faith community, or maybe they've gotten to that point where something's going on in their lives. Somebody invited them, or a crisis happens, or someone dies, or somebody gets sick, or whatever it is. Something really wonderful happens. And all of a sudden, they have a different openness to the parish. The first question is, what do I get? But it's not what's in it for me. There's something way deeper there. It was very interesting. I was talking about this at the big Los Angeles Religious Ed Congress one year, and I had 250 people in one of these great big huge auditorium rooms, and I invited people to kind of share a little bit, and a younger man raised his hand and he said, "May I share something with you?" And I said, "Absolutely." And he said, "I left for a while after I graduated from college." He said, "I moved to a new neighborhood and I just didn't connect, and I just kind of got out of the habit of going to Mass, and all of a sudden I looked around and it had been like 4 months and I hadn't been to Sunday Mass once, and I didn't really miss it, and so I just kind of went along, and a couple of years passed." And he said, "But there was always this something that said, I need to get back." And he said, and in that moment I kept thinking to myself, if I'm going to do this, I have to know that something's going to happen to me. That's what this is about. I have to know that there's going to be an impact. Again, we'll get back to that word. I have to know that there's something that's going to help me to live my life with meaning. It takes that to get people to the point where they can begin to focus on God and all of these things that we hope that they will. Interestingly, and we'll talk about this in greater detail in just a minute, at the foundation of this, people need to know what is expected. We need to have a set of common expectations. I think this is one of the greatest gifts that stewardship gives people. Because the common expectation is we're all on a journey of discipleship together. That's expectation number 1. And then if we do this annual commitment and renewal, one of the expectations is we're going to, at least annually, we're going to be thinking about how am I living my life? And what does that look like? And then at least we're going to be inviting everyone and expecting everyone to give in some particular ways, whatever that might be. When we began to study this research in my parish, by that time we had been around stewardship for about 10 years. And we had seen tremendous growth. Not only physical growth, we had seen physical growth, but we had also seen just amazing spiritual growth. But we were a large community, and we knew that there were a lot of people that still were not there. And so we started reading this research, and first of all, we found that the research describes some things that we had been experiencing that we didn't have an explanation for up until this point. Because we had all these people that were connecting with each other, and there's this kind of unknown there, but something was going on. So my pastor, we actually did a survey. We did the Gallup survey around engagement. And then my pastor preached at all of the masses one weekend, right as we were getting ready to start our stewardship commitment time. And he said, I think most of you will remember the survey that we did a few months ago, and you may remember this one question about, I know what's expected of me. And he said, and maybe it'll surprise you, but maybe it won't, that many of you said you're not so sure what's expected. And then he stopped and he looked out and he said, so let me tell you. And I stood in the back of church because I had read his script. He was really nervous about this, and so I kind of read and critiqued, and So I'm standing in the back of church, and I literally watched this happen. And then he said, now, you and I know that the first expectation is that we'll be here every Sunday, every holy day, hopefully some of you on a daily basis when you're able. But this is the most important thing. And we know that if we put God first, a whole lot of other things are going to fall into place. So that's expectation number one. And he says, but I know, and you know, that you're not here every weekend. And then this became this. Okay, he got me. And it got really quiet. And he says, so, expectation number one. We're going to be here. And I know that sometimes you can't make Mass here, so you go somewhere else. But whenever possible, we need to be a faith community together. I want you here. Number two, you know and I know that our hope and expectation is that every single person here is going to be on an ongoing journey of faith. And that requires some faith formation. And we offer all kinds of opportunities for people of every age throughout the year to learn about their faith, to reflect on their faith, and to grow in faith. And my hope and expectation is that you will do something about that every year. That's our second expectation. Third expectation is you know and I know that we do a lot of talking here about discipleship and stewardship. And our hope and expectation is that you're growing as a good steward and that you're giving of yourself and your resources as much as you're able at this point in your life. Those are the expectations. Nothing that you don't already know. And I literally felt people go, that's not so bad. We're okay. Nothing new here. So at the end of Mass, I kind of put myself in the corner and I watched these people go out. And I really thought it was going to be what I think of as duck and run Sunday. You know how sometimes the homilist says something that's really challenging, and so people kind of go, hi, Father, bye, Father, boom, they're out. That's not what happened. One by one, people one by one, thank you, Father. A lot of people stopped and said, I know that wasn't easy, but thank you, Father. And it wasn't easy. That was a really hard thing. And our pastoral council had talked about it, and all this. I know it wasn't easy. There was one dad with little kids, too, one on each hand, and he kind of waited for everybody else to go. And then he stood, and interestingly by the baptismal font, which I just thought was ever so appropriate. And he said, Father Jan, in our house, when we have something really important to talk about, we gather around the table and we have a family meeting. And I feel like that's what we did today. We gathered around the table and we had a family meeting. And I just want to thank you for that. And what I'm seeing over and over in parishes all over the place is people get really nervous about clarifying expectations. But when we do it, and it's not this overarching thou shalt, but rather this is what it means to be a person of faith, and this is what it means to be a person of faith in this particular community. People are grateful. People have that, wow, this is what, and all of a sudden we don't have insiders and outsiders. Everybody's on the same footing. So people need to know what the expectations are. They also need to know that their needs are going to be met. You know, every relationship has needs. And so in our spiritual relationships, we need to know that our spiritual needs are going to be met. I'll share some thoughts with you about that. Secondly, what do I give? We all have a need to give. And so right on the heels of what do I get is what do I give? Do we really give people the opportunity to contribute with meaning? How do we send the message that every single person is important? And we hope and expect that every single person will give in the ways that they feel called to, and that we're going to find ways to help you to discern that and to make a contribution. Thirdly, do I belong? When I look around myself, do I see others who are on this journey of faith with me? I may not know your name, but I know kind of where you sit. And then when I see you at the grocery store, I can at least say hello. When our daughter Carrie had her baby a year and a half ago, she had to have an emergency C-section. And I'm blessed in what I do in that I'm able to kind of set my own schedule at times. And so I carved out a couple of weeks around her due date. And so I was able to go out and stay with her for 2 weeks. And after the first week, she finally got to the point where she had her sea legs about her again. And she said, would it be okay if I went to the grocery store? And I said, sure. And so she went off and I took care of Patrick for an hour. And she came back and she was so excited. Mom, somebody at the grocery store stopped me and said, oh my goodness, you had your baby. Is everything okay? She'd never met this woman before. But all of a sudden she felt connected. This past weekend, she now lives in Nashville, Tennessee. This past weekend she said, so I hung out with Kenny Chesney in the back of church. Literally. He was taking care of the children while Nicole was in Mass. And Carrie was in the back of church with Patrick walking back and forth. And so she said, we kind of said hi, and on we went. So, but you know, we need to be connected to each other. That's important. And then finally, how can we grow? That's about mission. How can we grow? What is it that we're doing to help people to live and grow in their faith and to live as missionary disciples in the world? So I'm not going to walk through. There are actually 12 items. There are 12 things that lead to this engagement. I'm not going to walk through all 12. I'm only going to focus on a few. First of all, expectations. We've already talked about that. That's a big one, and that is actually foundational. It's not that we have to have this intentional conversation about this, at least at this point if you're not ready, but certainly be aware of this in terms of the things that you're doing around stewardship, because you really are helping people to know what's expected. What does it mean to belong here? Secondly, in my parish, my spiritual needs are met. Now, this one I have to tell you is a little bit harder, and I'll tell you why. As Catholics, we struggle with it because we look at Mass and the sacraments and we go, how could anybody say that their spiritual needs aren't being met? I mean, that's just mind-boggling. And yet, of all of those people that we'll think about in just a little while that are moving from church to church and denomination to denomination, and the ones that are opting out entirely, 3/4 of those people say they didn't feel their spiritual needs were being met. Yeah. There's this disconnection that happens. And I think that's understandable. You know, I think probably if we're really honest with ourselves, we can admit that there are times when we go to Mass and we kind of just go through the motions. And Mass is, who is it? I think maybe it's Father Robert Barron who says Mass is like solid food. And not everybody's ready for solid food yet, you know. And we tend to, when we're inviting, we tend to say to people, why don't you come to Mass with me? That may not be the best first place. because people aren't ready yet. And so I think there's something that we can understand in that. But I want to share with you some things that I've learned. I'll come back to it in just a second. The third step is, in my parish, I have the opportunity to do what I do best. And that actually becomes one of the primary drivers. There are two primary drivers of this whole process. One of those is this, and obviously that has a real stewardship connection right there. When people are able to strongly agree with that statement, they're 2.5 times more likely to be engaged than not engaged. They're 38 times more likely to be engaged than to be actively disengaged. That's big. The other primary driver, which is the overarching one, is belonging to some small group. Not necessarily a small faith community, but a community within the community. Again, it's about relationship. It's hard to feel like that you belong if you're not connected to somebody. I became connected to this woman, Diane, because I sat behind her at Mass one Saturday, and she turned around and said, "Would it be okay if you came and joined me?" And so I sat next to her. And then the next time I came into Mass, I sat next to her. And she said, "So tell me about yourself. What do you do?" And that's when I said, "Well, I kind of travel, and so I don't get here very often, but my husband's here every Saturday. He's back in the back ushering." And she said, "Well, what do you do that makes you travel?" It's like, how do I explain this? I said, "Well, I kind of do like leadership training in the church." "Really? Well, I'm going to pray for you." And on we went. Now I'm connected. And I would not come into St. Columban Church and sit in a different place and not say hi to Diane. That just isn't going to happen. So we need those opportunities to do what we do best. So before we go further, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about this together at your table for just a few minutes. What difference has belonging made for you? That's the question. What difference has belonging made for you in your life? Take just about 5 minutes, just talk to one other person. Just a one-on-one chat real quick, and then we're going to let that lead us into our next little chunk. Here's the thing, we know the difference that belonging within the parish makes. And we do want that for others because we know the difference our relationship with Christ makes in our lives. And not in a forceful, you have to have this way, but just to, wow, what a difference this makes in my life. And yet we know, especially in our time, not entirely among our younger adults, but many people are just at this place where they don't feel that they belong for one reason or another. And it really is becoming, first of all, this is not just a Catholic thing. It is predominantly a mainline Christian denomination thing. So our Methodist brothers and sisters and Lutherans and so on. It is now becoming also an evangelical thing. It's taken a little while longer for the evangelical churches to feel the pinch, but it's starting to happen to them as well. And we really are beginning to see the trickle out, where we're looking at how do we get people to trickle in. What we're watching is people are trickling out. While 1 in 3 Americans were raised in the Catholic faith, today fewer than 1 in 4 describe themselves as Catholics. Catholicism is still right now the largest religious group in the United States. The second largest group are those who consider themselves former Catholics. At least 10% of Americans, and some of the research actually says more than that. And again, not entirely a young adult thing, but it is definitely more prevalent among younger adults. And we'll see that in just a moment. Now, I had an interesting situation a couple of years ago at the big stewardship conference. For whatever reason, I had this conversation with so many different people. And so I volunteered to do a workshop on the folks that are called the spiritual but not religious. Mm-hmm. We know that dynamic, right? There really are actually 2 groups of people that we need to be aware of at this point. Some are the spiritual but not religious, and some are the ones that we call the unaffiliated. They don't belong to any denomination. So I just want, real quick, just show of hands, just as a way of helping us get thinking about that. The spiritual but not religious are not members of congregations. How many would say that's true? The spiritual but not religious are not members of congregations. Yeah, actually that's not true. That was one of the biggest surprises for me. Over 60% of those who call themselves spiritual but not religious are actually members of congregations. Somewhere around 20% of Catholics. So you've got people that are coming to Mass, but they really struggle with the institutional church. We'll look in a minute at the whole idea of spirituality. There's a great emphasis on spirituality in our surrounding culture, but it's not institutional. And I should mention here, this isn't only about church. This is all institutions. People are very suspicious of institutions right now for all kinds of good reasons. So, yeah. Secondly, most people who identify themselves as spiritual but not religious do not believe in God. I keep thinking I'm going to take that question out because that's kind of self-evident. Absolutely, they do. It's how it's expressed that is a little bit different. How about this one? Those who are not religiously affiliated are most frequently found among younger adults. How many would say that's true? Yes, absolutely. Yes. The unaffiliated, the ones that they're not registered members, they don't consider themselves part of any denomination, much more frequently among younger adults. How about this one? The unaffiliated, those who don't belong, are a stable yet growing segment of the population. How many would say that's true? Yeah, that one's not. That one's the trick question among the and we'll look at that one in just a second. So here's just a little peek into some of this. The spiritual but not religious, slightly more women than men, more common among younger adults, but not entirely younger adults. We've got people of all ages who are there. But the majority of them do come to Sunday service of whatever sort. The nones, N-O-N-E-S, are the ones that on a survey say, what denomination are you? None, right? Yeah, that over 30% of Americans under the age of 30. So a third of our younger adults. Now, some of them will say, I was raised Catholic. I think there's an evangelizing opportunity there. We've got a lot of people who still see themselves somehow as connected to Catholicism. They just haven't found their place yet. And so I think there's a real opportunity. And as I've watched my children, my young adult children, go through marriage prep, baptism prep, those are huge evangelizing opportunities. I know we know this. But when we think about stewardship, well, first of all, we rely on the stewardship of parishioners, our deacons, whoever those people are that do all of that preparation. I have really become convinced that we need to think about mentor couples, mentor parents. How do we link people in such a way that they've got somebody else going, yeah, I don't have all the answers, but boy, I just have to tell you what a difference this is making in my life. What a difference that could make in and of itself. Here's the deal, though. The view isn't quite as clear as even all of that suggests, and I'll tell you why. This comes back to that whole thing. First of all, our younger adults are opting out really young. Most of them opt out by the age of 24. I just saw a study this week, and I shared it with my husband, who's the 7th grade catechist, that many of our children who say that they don't believe in God make that decision before age 10. Yeah. And it's that thing about science. They really think that we're at odds with science. And so the interesting part of this particular study was, if children are being catechized in an environment where they're helped to see the place of science in our lives of faith, they're much more likely to see that this is a viable way of life. And so I sent that to my husband, and then that night at dinner time I said, by the way, did you see that? He said, yeah, already sent it to the DRE. Said we need to know this, right? If we're going to be teaching our kids and our teenagers, they need to know that. Some of those who were raised unaffiliated, because now we're in a second and third generation of people who have never experienced an ongoing life of faith in their family, many of those people are coming into faith as adults. They're saying, I looked at my friends who went to church and I always felt like I was missing out on something. They say they feel called by God. They say they feel called by a life of worship. So that stable but growing, it's not a stable population. We've got this very fluid. People come and go. And so as we think about how we call people to live as disciples and to grow as good stewards, these are good things for us to know. Because then we can be attentive to how welcoming is our parish. You know, what does our parish do to send the message that wherever you are in your life, you belong here?
Is there a percentage that goes with
Of this?
Right.
Yeah, I wish I could remember. It's like 10% are now no longer part of the church, but the church is growing by about 2.5% a year. So that gives you some idea of the outflow is still larger than the incoming, but at least there are some that are coming in. And not all of that is from immigration. Some of that comes through immigration. Some of that comes through, a lot of it comes through marriage. You know, people that come in to the church by way of a pre-Cana experience or whatever. But at least we have some that are coming to kind of counteract the outflow. I'm going to skip that. And what I'd like for us to do is to start making one more shift. I want for us to think about what is it that people are looking for. So we know what's happening. We know that we've got people who are not engaged, who are in our pews all the time. And consciously or unconsciously, they're really waiting for one of us to kind of tap them on the shoulder and say, why don't you come with me on this journey? We also have people who aren't with us. And one of the interesting things, and I'm missing a slide, and that's why I just stopped here, because I don't want to forget to say this. One of the key learnings of the engagement research is this. While we pay a lot of time and attention and energy trying to figure out how to bring back the ones that have gone and how to stop the fusses of the cave dwellers, what the research says is that we would do better to take a little of that time and attention and energy to build on what's working and build up the engaged, the folks like you that are already committed. Because it's by the engaged that the not engaged come in. And the actively disengaged will come by way of God's time. Usually, honestly, by way of somebody who's right now not engaged. Real quick story to paint this illustration. It's not a perfect illustration, but it comes pretty darn close. I had the blessing of directing the RCIA for 10 years. And shortly after Easter one year, this young man, Kevin, called and he said, can I come in and talk with you? And so Kevin came in, and Kevin was the son of an evangelical preacher. And he had actually thought for one time about kind of following in his dad's footsteps, and he had started taking classes, and then he decided that this just was not what he was called to do. And he had finished a college degree in computer science, and he was an IT professional. And he had a friend, Ken, who invited him to come to Easter Sunday Mass with him. Now, that in and of itself, I thought to myself, okay, I believe in Easter, but I'm not sure I would bring a total stranger to Easter Sunday Mass. And Ken just didn't actually think about the fact that Easter Sunday is like crazy, and so they didn't get there till 5 minutes before Mass began. And we have that balcony that seats 300, and they got a seat, but they ended up in the very last row of the balcony. And it was so interesting because one of the first things that Kevin said is, it was like you were all one body. He said, you crossed yourselves, and you knelt, and you stood, and you sat, and you crossed yourselves again. And he said, it was like you all knew what to do. And I was fascinated. And he says, but the thing that really got me was that after Mass, Ken stood out in the gathering space talking with this group of guys. And he said, all of a sudden, I was washed over by this feeling of, I want what he has. Well, it turns out Ken was a man who had grown up Catholic, had been away for a long time. One of his friends had invited him to a men's retreat during Lent. And those men that he was standing by the font with were his Christ Renews His Parish brothers. And that's the pattern. The engaged reach out and draw in the not engaged. The not engaged, in this case, drew in somebody that wasn't Catholic, but they also bring back the ones that were Catholic and have gone. That's the pattern. So, we need to think about what is it that people are looking for? What is it that they're seeking? Because that's going to help us to figure out, what do we do about all of this? How do we, in the ways that we can, in all of the little ways that we can, what do we do? And so, I want to offer 3 ideas, and then we're going to take a stretch break, and I understand there are snacks out in the room. We need that at this time. You know, it's 1:45 in the afternoon. We're getting there, right? So what are they looking for? First of all, they're looking for a spiritual dimension. A lot of what I'm going to share with you in this next 10 minutes draws specifically around research and experience of pastoral leaders around younger adults, but I'm convinced whatever's good for the younger adults is good for all of us. A spiritual dimension. We are hardwired for a relationship with God. Our catechism begins by saying, we have a hunger. God has planted within each of our hearts a hunger for God. And so there's this spiritual something. And we see this reflected in all of these books on spirituality and self-help. And all that is a look at, I've got this something that's going on in my life that I don't know what to do with. And oh my gosh, that may have something to do with God. David Kinnaman, who is the president of the Barna Group, and it should be an A, not an S, it's Kinnaman. Barna does a lot of research, particularly around younger adults and spirituality and religious life, along with all sorts of other things. He says they see spirituality as connected to all of their life. These are younger adults, not a compartment within their life. We need bridges, here we come with that bridges idea again, between Monday to Friday and Sunday. Yeah. How do we help people to make that connection between what they experience on Sunday at the liturgy and the rest of their lives? Now, faith formation people have been talking about this for years. But again, I think stewardship has something particular to offer because we're helping people to say, practically speaking, what does this look like? Well, we're going to think about everything that we are and have has been given to us by God. And we have this great responsibility to be good stewards of that. And this is the impact, the lay witness, this is the impact that this has had in my life. And this is what I hope you'll think about. So there's this real, tangible connection. They're also looking for a personal connection. And the Gallup research says this, but so does a lot of other research that's been done around younger adults in particular, but all of us. We're hardwired for this relationship. You know, this isn't a me and Jesus thing. This is about we and Jesus. So we come back to that whole idea of spiritual needs. And again, I'm not going to belabor this, but I do think that this is important. I got really boggled by this whole idea of people feeling like their spiritual needs aren't being met. And so I decided to create a different sort of survey. This is not the random, anonymous Gallup Pew Forum survey where somebody calls you on the phone and says, can you give me 5 minutes? I'd like to ask you questions. This is actually much more like a big focus group. But I have over 4,100 responses to date. So this is a big focus group, international, around spiritual needs. Your parish can opt in. You can give your people the link to the survey. If you decide to do that, let me know and I add your parish's name to the list from which they can choose, and then you get your parish's report of how your people answered the questions on this survey. So I have places all over the country, people of all ages taking this. One of the first questions that I ask is, how would you describe your relationship with God? Do you have a deep faith that shapes your life? Or do you have faith that needs strengthening? And, you know, it's a little more than half, just at 51%, that say they have a deep faith. Now, I think probably any of us at any given moment in our lives might say, yeah, I have faith that needs strengthening. So that in and of itself isn't terribly surprising. But here is what is surprising maybe for some of us. I asked the question, what helps you grow spiritually? One of the things that I learned from the people at Gallup is if you want to know something, ask it. So what helps you grow spiritually? And here's what people say. All ages, both men and women, slightly different order. Participation in Mass, thanks be to God. 86%. Now these are people that go to Mass, are motivated enough to go home, get online, do a survey. And yet we've got 14, 15% of people that are saying, and it's not a choose 3, it's check as many as apply. 14 options. It doesn't even register. Mass isn't there. Daily prayer, belonging to my parish. I saw that, I literally wept. I've been teaching people about belonging since 2006 when the engagement book came out, and all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, from our own people's lips, there it is. And having good friends who share their faith with me. Those are the top 4. Among younger adults, belonging comes up, daily prayer comes down. So it's Mass, belonging, prayer, good friends. Among teenagers, no surprise, good friends comes up. So it's Mass, friends, belonging, prayer. But it's the same 4 things, regardless of age. What helps us grow spiritually? There's this personal and communal prayer, but there's also this being connected to each other. We have this need to belong. Secondly, what helps you find meaning or purpose in life? I swore this was going to be the title of my next book, and then I went for Grateful Disciples instead. Family, faith, and friends in that order. Family, faith, and friends. How do we foster family life? We've had some conversations around that with the Synod on the family, but we still have a long way to go there. Yeah.
This is like 96% of our time is spent around family.
That's exactly.
Like 96%
Yeah.
of our entire lives.
And yet people will say, you know, I had to go through all this stuff to do marriage prep, but once I was married, nobody's helping me live it, you know? Or what do I do when my spouse dies? Or what do I do when my spouse gets sick? All of these, you know, you send me through baptism prep, but then you don't help me be a good parent. We have all kinds of things that we can be thinking about. And again, how's that going to happen? It's going to happen through the stewardship of people in our parishes and in our dioceses. And then finally, those who said they have faith that needs strengthening, I actually said, okay, so what would you actually do? Not what would you like, but what would you do? And I gave people 7 options and said, put them in rank order. The number 1 thing, to have a faith mentor to share with. I didn't want to say spiritual director. That might be a little bit off-putting, and not every parish has spiritual directors. But to have a faith mentor. What would it look like? And maybe it wouldn't change anything, but what would it look like if we went to our confirmation sponsors and said, think of yourself as a mentor? Yeah. And on and on. Okay, so people have this need for a spirituality, a spiritual dimension in their lives. They're looking for a personal connection, and one more thing, and again, direct stewardship connection. They have this need to contribute to the mission of Christ and the church. They want to give of themselves with meaning. 85% of younger adults say they're motivated to give by a compelling mission or cause. They need to have a trust relationship with the people that are asking them to give of their time or their financial resources. They need micro-volunteering opportunities. In other words, I need that toe in the water. Don't ask me to do something for the rest of my life. Tell me I can do something on a Saturday and let me try it out. And they also need to know that what they're doing makes a difference. So, spiritual dimension, personal connection, the opportunity to contribute to the mission of Christ and the church. And with that, it is 5 till 2. We're going to come back at 10 after 2. We're rounding the bend. We've got one more big chunk of stuff. I think you're going to like it. So stand up, take a break. There's stuff out on the side. I understand there's iced tea in the offing. And we will be back in just a moment. So that's our big picture. That's our vision. We've got specific things that we need to do as stewardship leaders, as parish leaders, to help to foster this living and growing stewardship in the lives of ourselves and our parishioners. But we also have this bigger thing. about the evangelizing community, about forming a parish community that really leads people to embrace this way of life. We looked at what people are needing. They need a spiritual dimension in their lives. They need personal connection, and they need the opportunity to contribute. So what are we going to do about that? Well, I have been thinking about this next part for a really long time. And in fact, if you had gone to a workshop with me almost 10 years ago, you would have heard me talking about this. But I have to tell you the story. I think what we need to do is I think we need to build bridges. I love that Pope Francis uses that bridge image a lot, which makes sense actually because you know the word pontifex, from which we get the word pope, actually means bridge builder. That's who the Pope is. The Pope is a person who helps to build a bridge between Christ and the world. And as people who are connected to the Pope, we also are called to build bridges. And we're going to build bridges to the people around us. We're going to build bridges to the folks that we know, that circle that we're around at church on Sunday. They're going to build bridges to the people that they know, and it ripples out. So when you leave here today, my hope is one of the things that you'll do is you'll go back and you'll build a bridge around all of this good stuff to the people that you serve with. Whoever is in your committee, your council, your ministry coordinators, whoever those people are. And that's why in your packet there is a worksheet about who are your leaders. You need to think about who is it that leads? Who are those leader people? And build bridges intentionally to them. And then they're going to build bridges to the people, and they need to understand that this is part of their role, to build bridges to the people that they know. And eventually we begin to build those bridges to the people beyond ourselves. That's the big picture. But in the midst of this, I have to tell you a story. So the older I get, the more I find I'm a very visual person. And a lot of times, as I'm thinking about things, I have to have the pictures. And then the pictures help me to really think about things. So I spent one evening, finding all these different pictures of bridges. And I had just about gotten this slide ready. My husband came and he stood behind me. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I'm just working on a new idea." He said, "Well, what about?" And I said, "Well, we need to build bridges to each other." And he went, And I am not making this up. He's a bridge engineer. I had not thought about that. But when I did, then this whole thing took on an even deeper meaning. Because here's what I know about what Steve does. They don't just go putting steel up. They have to think about how far down does the pier have to go, right? They have to say, how are we going to build this in a way that it's going to last? It's going to stand the test of time. They have to think about where are they going with this bridge? What's the approach? They use that word. What's the approach? And sometimes that varies, and so they can go around the best way possible. But sometimes they have something that is an existing something that they have to work around. And then they have to deal with whatever it is. And they do that. And I think that says something to us. As we think about our parishes, sometimes we can start from scratch and we can go, oh my gosh, it would be so great if we did. But a lot of times it's about thinking about what do we already have in place? And how are we going to work with that? I was telling somebody at lunch, for me, this is not always about doing more. A lot of us are doing as much as we can possibly do. Our parishes are doing as much as we can possibly do. But we can pay attention to how we do what we do. And be more intentional sometimes in the way in which we go about all of this. One of the projects that Steve loved the most that he had done was a project just a few years ago. And if you go online and you Google through YouTube, Milton Madison Bridge, you will see this most fascinating thing. It's a bridge that crosses the Ohio River between two little towns, Milton, Kentucky and Madison, Indiana. And the Milton-Madison Bridge had one of those already existing somethings that they had to deal with. They could not change where the roads were. And they couldn't tear down the old bridge until the new one was ready, because the next nearest bridge is 40 miles away. And there are people that live in one town and they work on the other side of the river, and so they were going to have to go 80 miles a day just to get to work and back. So they built the bridge in sections, and they ferried it across the river, and they built the bridge. And then they took the old one out, and then they moved the new one into place. And so you can go on YouTube, and they've got a time-lapse video, and you can see the bridge moving. Literally. I showed it to my friend Stephanie, and her comment was, look at how many people it takes to build a bridge. Yeah. So it's going to take all of us. And some of what we're going to think about is, what do we as individual people do? Some of this, it's very systemic, but yet it's dependent upon each of us. And so what I'd like to suggest are 3 bridges that each of us can build and that our parishes can build. But first, just another little note from Pope Francis, who says, the Lord made bridges. Christians who are afraid to build bridges and prefer to build walls are not sure of their faith, not sure of Jesus Christ. Build bridges and move forward. Okay, there we go. But as I think we already recognize, bridges are built person to person. This is a lot of just being. It's a lot of just drawing people in. And yes, there are some systemic, foundational things that we're going to do, but there also are some things that we're going to think about in terms of our individual relationships. So I'd like to suggest 3. The first is welcome. We've already thought about this. I'd like to suggest just a few more things about welcome, because we know how important this is. Pope Francis said at one point, instead of just being a church that welcomes and receives by keeping doors open, let us try also to be a church that finds new roads, that's able to step outside of itself and go to those who do not attend Mass, to those who have quit or are indifferent. The ones who quit sometimes do it for reasons that, if properly understood and assessed, can lead to a return, but that takes audacity and courage. I think it takes audacity and courage on both ends. We know that we can invite and somebody can turn us down, and that feels really vulnerable, and we have to be able to find that way of saying, that's okay, and then maybe 3 months later, invite again in a different way, to a different something. And that's challenging for many of us. But it's also a really risky thing for the one that's being invited, because they don't know. Well, I've been away for a while. What are people going to think? Or people know me. Do they really want me around? Does the church have a place for someone like me? And so it's risky for all of us. But I think we need to be audacious and courageous in the ways of welcome and hospitality. I do think this is as much about who we are as what we do. I think it's that way of just conveying always and everywhere. I find as I talk with parishioner leaders, and I have to say, I have not heard this from any of you, which is very inspiring. But it's not uncommon for me to work with a parish group, and there'll be somebody there that the whole time that I'm talking, they're going, but. And so I spend a lot of my time reframing and putting things in a positive light. And I think that's what you're going to do as you go back to your parishes. Okay, it's not going to be a but, it's going to be an and. My friend Stephanie loves to say it's an and more. We're inviting people into the family. The engagement research says we need 4 engaged parishioners for every 1 actively disengaged. We need a 4-to-1 probability. Yeah. We need a 4-to-1 probability that when somebody walks into church, they're going to meet somebody happy, engaged, grateful, and welcoming than one of those fussy people. Because those fussy people can turn us away and turn us off faster than anything. So that's the ideal. That's what we're aiming toward. We're going to work with our leader people, because they are the ones that set the tone. Second bridge, friendship. I sometimes think it's easier to talk about friendship than it is to talk about relationship. Relationship is kind of scary for a lot of people for all kinds of reasons, but it's easier to say, could we just become friends? There are all sorts of opportunities to just give people the opportunity to get to know each other. Think about the parents that come for sacramental prep. Think about the parents of children preparing for First Holy Communion. We almost always have that mandatory parent meeting, right? So what if we invite people to come to that meeting and we not only convey the information that we need, but we give them something to talk about at table, over a cup of coffee, or whatever. When I go out and do work with catechetical people, which I do a lot of, I sometimes go to the parish and I actually have a parent meeting that I call How to Help Your Child Grow Up Catholic. And part of how to help your child is this moment where the parents think about the things that happened in their home as they were growing up, whatever denomination. And some of them will say, we never went to church. That just wasn't part of our lives. But most of them will say, well, we used to say prayer before meals, or Christmas was a really big deal, or the family would gather at Thanksgiving and we would all go around and say something that we were thankful for, or whatever it is. And at the end of the night, I learned after the very first one of those to have 3x5 cards on the table so that the parents could trade contact information, email address, phone number. Because I said, this was really kind of cool, but I'd like to be able to stay in touch. Or they would say, are you on Facebook? It would be kind of nice. And then they see each other in the grocery store or the soccer field or the baseball, whatever it is, and all of a sudden they know each other in a different sort of way. How do we draw one another into a different kind of connection that's rooted in faith? Those life circumstance groups. We had a group of guys, dads, in the parish at one point that came to, I was the director of faith formation, so I was the one that everybody came to with their ideas. And most of the ideas stuck. A few of them didn't, but this one really did. It still exists. They wanted to start a dad's group that was kind of akin to Promise Keepers, right? Promise Keepers is a Protestant support group for dads. They wanted it to be thoroughly Catholic. A lot of the men that initially started this group were men who traveled for work. So they left Monday morning and they came back Thursday evening. So they were not going to give up a weekend time with their kids. And this was all about being better dads. So they started the Fathers team. I don't remember what Father stands for, but it stood for something. Fathers team meets still at 6:03 on Friday morning because 6 o'clock would be just too darn early. And on any given Friday morning, they'll have 30 to 40 men. They reached this point where the first generation, their kids were going to college, and they said, do we have to stop coming? Well, no, you're still a dad. Now a lot of these guys are grandfathers, but they have younger dads coming. They emailed me this year, this is how I know that they still exist, asking me about a particular program that I was connected to and asking how they would get information about that. And it's faith formation, and it's fellowship, and it's support, and they meet at 6:03, and by 7:15 they're out the door and on their way to work. Now, that's a life circumstance group. I have to say there were other men that said, we're not doing 6 o'clock in the morning. We're just not. My husband was one of those guys. So they decided to do the Men's Fellowship League, MFL. And yes, in fact, the MFL meets on Monday night, once a month. And it's faith formation, some sharing, and then snacks and whatever game might happen to be on. And those were the men that my husband missed when we moved away from the parish 9 years ago. So, there are all kinds of ways to give people that. All we have to do is open the door, set the stage. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it happens without us. At one point we got all excited about neighborhood ministry, and we got the map and we looked at our parish boundaries and all of the different neighborhoods, and we found a different neighborhood captain for every single neighborhood, and then what we found out was they were already doing it. We went to this group of people and they went, oh yeah, we already do that. We had a parish directory with all of the names of all of the parishioners, and it got updated once a year by our bulletin company. And what they did that turned out to be the greatest blessing of all was, in the back of the book, they listed the parishioner families by street. So the parishioners said that was the first thing they went to. They wanted to see who moved into their street. And then they'd call them and say, why don't we get together on a Friday afternoon? Friendship. We want to help people to get connected. We want to build that Velcro. And then thirdly, and again, greatest stewardship connection, sharing. We want to help people to know that the big expectation is discipleship. And the spirituality around this is that of living as stewards, growing in gratitude, living as in generosity because God is generous. God's never outdone in generosity, as St. Catherine of Siena says. And so we're going to help people to know that their giving really makes a difference. So, I have one more worksheet. And again, same process, just different prompts. And this time what I'd like to do, well, I think we'll just let you do whatever. Just choose one of the three, welcome, friendship, or sharing. And do that little discovery, what's already in place. And then that dream, what would it be like if it was our ideal? And we're going to take about 10 minutes for this conversation. We're all starting to fade. I can feel it. That afternoon snack kind of did, oh yeah. But here's the thing. If you hear something from somebody else at your table, jot it down. Now's the time to start trading some ideas. So, 10 minutes, and then we're going to come back and I'm going to tell you about that website and how to stay connected to all this good stuff.